All right. My name is Michael Francis. I have been doing web development for about, I guess, 6 or 7 years now, doing full stack, so doing from back-end servers, database management, all the way to front-end web application development. Historically, most of that was working in PHP, a lot of AngularJS in its earlier days, your other frameworks like Flutter Bootstrap for CSS and things like that. My first job was working at a company called Flutter, and it was a printing company, but I worked on a document management system for WellPoint, or Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield. That's their parent company. So they printed all their marketing materials through us. So we had an automated printing system where their salespeople could go on and customize a document and automatically go through our printing systems. It's like bulk orders. So it was very specific for their needs. After that, I went to work for a company called Bellwether Corp, which is a purchase management system. For big purchase orders. So if you're in construction, you have to order a bunch of nails or different things you need for construction, and you submit purchase orders. You don't usually pay with credit card with that. The payment processing is a little bit different. So I did that for a couple years, and then my last job was at a company called Edumedics, which is I think they're beyond the startup phase, but they are a healthcare company providing healthcare services for individuals. And then about a year ago, I quit working for anyone and started working for myself full-time on my startup called SolariumVR. Throughout this time, I've always been a fan of Dart. So Dart is a programming language created by Google. So a little history on it. I guess it appeared kind of around 2011, which is quite a while ago now. Their goal was to replace JavaScript on the web. So instead of having JavaScript run on your web browser, everyone would use Dart. That was their original goal. Maybe not necessarily replace it, but run alongside of it. But that kind of fell through because they couldn't get everyone else to adopt Dart in the browser. So like Chrome or Firefox and Internet Explorer, they didn't want to go through with it. So the project kind of failed. But it's kind of a good example of how a company or a project can pivot and learn. And even though one thing may be failing, you still have something valuable. So they didn't just give up on the language altogether. What they ended up doing is they implemented a Dart to JavaScript compiler. So you can write all your code in Dart, and then it will compile to JavaScript and then run on any browser that supports JavaScript. There is the Dartium project, which is a version of Chrome that has the Dart VM, and that still exists today, and they still use it for development purposes, but no end user, no consumer actually uses that product. Dart has also evolved to be a lot more than just a Dart to JavaScript compiler. You can run it on command line, very similar to Nodejs for JavaScript. So people have developed back-end servers working with databases and stuff using Dart. There's also a project called Flutter, which is a project to get Dart running on Android and iOS. I'll try to talk about that a little bit because anyone doing front end should probably dabble at least a little bit in some mobile development, and Flutter is an interesting project. But I'll try to focus mostly on web since that's what we're supposed to be focused on, and since it compiles to JavaScript. Before I keep on going, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand, and I'll try to answer your questions. So as Alex said, this was supposed to be a lightning talk, so I'll kind of just throw in more slides, and we'll just see how it goes. So the language itself, when they made it, they wanted it to be a very familiar language. So again, it's a Google product, so you got to look at what languages does Google use inside of their big corporation, and Java is a huge language used in Google, and if you look at the syntax of Dart, it looks very, very, very similar to Java. But it's an object-oriented language. It has what we call strong mode, which is a sort of a statically typed language. So that means it's not dynamic in the sense that, like JavaScript, if you assign a variable to a string, you can later change that to an integer or float or whatever you want, or to a class. So Dart doesn't allow you to do that. So if you say this object is a string, it has to stay a string. I know we'll go into some code examples and stuff, so you'll see things.
So it's kind of like the const on JavaScript now, where you can't change it afterwards.
That's const is going to kind of, but it's a little bit different.
Not exactly.
Yeah. So if you go, it does do some runtime checks. There's a few things it can't do ahead of time. But even though it does have this keyword called dynamic. So let's say you have something that may be a string or a number or whatever. You can just say that variable is dynamic, and that is the equivalent of a JavaScript variable. All right, so Dart's best features is its SDK. It's not necessarily the language itself. So anyone hear the story of the left pad debacle? Anyone know what that is? No. All right, so this has to do with, I guess it would apply to a lot of different things. So with the Node.js and JavaScript ecosystem, there's been a lot of packages, small little libraries, micro libraries that really don't do much. I guess, I don't know, maybe a year or two ago that I guess one of these packages was taking off the internet, essentially, and it broke everyone. And all this was a left pad. And all it was just a method that added extra spaces on a word, and that was it. Like, this is something that you can do in a couple lines of code. The idea that you need an extra package to do something like that is a little silly. But the benefit of Dart is it includes a lot of stuff inside of the core language itself via some libraries. So you get a lot going forward. Where in the JavaScript world, you would have to find packages to help you do that stuff. Or in this case, it's just all packaged in with your development environment with Dart. And I'll show you some stuff on that too. So here's just an example of one couple lines. So these two lines are essentially doing the same thing, but it shows. So here it's inferring the type. So this first line, we're saying we have a map that is a string to dynamic. So this would be, if you notice, like over here, this looks like JSON, right? So JSON is an example where the values over here are dynamic. Here we have a string, over here we have a integer, but our keys are always going to be strings. But this line here is the exact same thing. It's just using this variable keyword, but it's able to deduce what the actual type is under there. So if you look at your IDE and hover over this in your IDE, it'll tell you that it's a map that's has a string as keys and dynamic as the values. And then Dart 2.0 is going to come out soon, and I won't go into any features but these are some of the features that I'm interested in. There's union types. They're going to drop the new keyword. They're going to add some REST parameters and a lot of stuff. So the language is still growing. It's still changing a lot. So it does have a big ecosystem kind of growing around it. But one thing to realize is Dart is very much a Google product built for Google by Google. So that's a plus because they're using it for a lot of their internal projects, and those are the projects that are making them billions of dollars. So they're using them for very, very, very big projects. The downside is there's not that much of an external community built around it. So most of the people working on Dart are at Google, which it has its pluses because it is. People always joke about Google products disappearing, but this is one. It's not going to disappear. There's been too much time, too much money, and they're using it for making too much money. So it is going to stay around for a while. So there are some frameworks. So this is just, right, Dart's just a language. So on mobile, there's the Flutter framework. On the front end side, there is a version of Angular that is built entirely in Dart. And then there's two server-side frameworks that would be similar to, like on the PHP, something like Laravel or Spring on Java or ASP.NET for C# and .NET. So those are Aqueduct and Angle. Most people probably wouldn't use Dart for server-side stuff because it's just not that popular. But it is kind of convenient that you could have a language that just similar to JavaScript, where you can use Node.js on your server and JavaScript on the client side. It's the benefit of having one language running everywhere. So that's a benefit. And we may talk about Flutter later. So I was going to try to program. I was going to my goal was to show how we could deploy an Android, iOS app, a web server, and a website within 30 minutes. Because you could do that. Unfortunately, I had problems with this laptop because I haven't used it for so long. Nothing worked. So I wasn't able to get everything going. But for example, getting a Flutter app on Android and iOS, it literally would take you an hour to get their Hello World version up and running and having your binaries that you can deploy to iOS.
Now
and
you
Android.
can do it even though you're on a Windows laptop. You'll still be able to deploy to iOS.
Well, you may not be able to do the final build, but you can essentially, because it doesn't use much of the iOS core stuff. So,
Gotcha.
But I won't go too far in that.
Gotcha.
I'll get into showing an example. Does any questions? As of right now, I know you haven't really seen the language that much, but as we go in, no questions. All right. So what did I end up deciding to do? I was like, hey, let's just since we're at a place where everyone here likes to make video games. So I thought about just trying to make a small, very basic video game, a little asteroid shooter type thing. The game itself won't be very cool, but it will show you the language and some of the basics. So we'll see how this goes. I'm just going to. I would recommend, if you're going to use Dart, I would absolutely recommend using WebStorm as your IDE. The Dart team pretty much focuses primarily on getting WebStorm. There is a Visual Studio Code plugin for Dart, but it's not supported by the Dart team. But it works, but I would recommend WebStorm. So I'm going to start a new project here. Let's see if you guys can see everything here. Good thing with WebStorm, it comes with some nice Hello World examples, so you can get going with the Angular Dart web app, a barebone web app, a console application, just a Dart package. So a Dart package would just be like a library that you're giving out to other people. StageXL is actually another cool project. I haven't looked too much in it, but it was the goal of that framework or library was to help people who used to work on Flash and have it very familiar to those people, so they can move to doing some web, using I think it has like a WebGL underlying rendering. So it's very familiar for people who used to use Flash. So if you're wanting to make a game on, it may be a good thing to look at if you want to make a HTML web game. And then they have a basic web server. But what I'm going to do, I'm just going to do the bare bones web app. And how does that read for everyone? Can everyone read it fairly enough, or do I need to make it larger? Looks good. Okay. So when you set this up, you just have one directory, and it comes with some just files to start out with. So you have your index.html. That's going to be your main index HTML file. your main.dart. So this is going to be turned into JavaScript. And then just a CSS file. So one thing Dart doesn't do, and so it doesn't necessarily replace like projects like Webpack or Grunt or Gulp, some of those packaging and tooling that you have on Node.js. So like it doesn't automatically package all your styles file or CSS files into one and do things like that. You need other tools to do that. But it is mainly just to compile all your JavaScript or Dart to JavaScript. So that's the basics of it there. Then the other main file you need to understand is this pubspec.yaml. So this is, if you're working with Node.js, this is the equivalent of your packages.json. So you just, it has a name, description, and version. The environment, so that means what Dart SDK are you using. And then you can add your dependencies. So this would just be same like installing an npm package with Node. So right now, I'm not going to put any packages. I am going to uncomment this. You can ignore that for now. So then I'm just going to run a command here. It comes with a little tool called pub. I'm just going to call pub serve. And essentially, I got to run pub get. So pub get's going to update all the dependencies first. Oh, of course, I turned off Wi-Fi because hopefully my computer doesn't run to a crawl. All right, so pub. So that's pub get, and then I'll call pub serve, and all that's doing is it's essentially starting up a small web server that's hosting all these files for this project. And it loads it up at localhost. And nothing exciting. Your Dart app is running, right? Exciting stuff here. All right. So here's my Dart file. They have an import in this. It's importing a package called Dart HTML. So this is one of those packages that's included in the SDK. So it's with you no matter what. Essentially, this HTML package is, its code essentially lets you do everything that a web browser does. So like you have your document object in JavaScript, your window object, and accessing all your DOM elements in JavaScript. So these are just kind of synonymous to those. So here we have a nice query selector. So we're looking for the output, the element with the ID of output. So, all right, for those that may not understand, so it's looking for any element with that ID of output. And it says your Dart app is running, so it's adding that text to it. So before that was just an empty div, and it's adding the text.
So it automatically compiles it into JavaScript for you, or is it just...
So yeah, so I have to refresh this anytime I refresh. So if I go, let's see here, and yeah, and I can show you the JavaScript that it creates. Change that to exclamation points. Oh, this is so exciting. And then just refresh, and there it's updated. So if we bring up our tools, sources here. Yeah, and there we go. So here is the JavaScript that it generated. It's probably kind of small.
Oh, wow. So it kind of saves you a lot of work there, and it generates it for you.
Yeah. So has anyone here used TypeScript or is familiar with TypeScript? One. Okay. So TypeScript. So I would recommend you check out Dart or TypeScript after this event. They're highly used, or TypeScript is probably a little bit more common among a lot of corporations now. But it again, it's another programming language that compiles to JavaScript. but it provides extra features and stuff that makes it a lot more easier to write larger scale applications. I was going to do some comparisons, but since not many people know what TypeScript is, I won't do that. So here, like, no one would probably write this in JavaScript. It's a little bit extra code than what you would need to do that bare bones. So you wouldn't use Dart just to add an alert box to a button or just do small little things on a website. It wouldn't make sense. It's too much boilerplate to warrant using a different language. But if you're building a large-scale SaaS application, this is when Dart's going to become more valuable. Let's see here. I'll close that. So I'll try to go over just some of my favorite features of Dart, and just kind of do some basic stuff. So my laptop is going slow, so just be patient with me. So Dart has classes. I guess JavaScript now officially has classes. Is it packaged? Yeah. So I can make a class called player. I can give this player, so if I'm making a game, right, this player has a username, so I'll say it has a string of username. And then I can create what's called a constructor for that class. And I'm just going to do, so here I'm just doing this.username. So I've already defined this this username as a property on this class. So doing this.username is just associating these two properties. Okay. If I didn't do that, an alternative way of doing this is by doing, I could have done given it a type, I'll give it a different name just for, and then I could have said username, oops. Right, so this is doing the equivalent of the same thing. So you're going to pass in your username, and it's going to assign your username to username, which is up here. So this style is a lot cleaner, so I try to use it as much as possible. Right. So also, every class in Dart has a toString method. So a toString method is some way to describe this class in a string so it's readable and either on the website or through a log system. So I want to implement a toString, and for the toString I'm just going to return the username. I'm going to say the username is, so Dart has what we call string literals, so I can pass in, so a lot of language you would see people doing a plus symbol and then adding the variable, and then maybe they need to add more stuff.
They don't have anything like template literals.
So that, yeah, so that's how a lot of programmings would do this, but it does allow for template literals here. So I can get rid of that. I can use this dollar symbol with some brackets here and just refer to the.
Oh, and you don't need the backticks. You can still use the regular quotes, or.
Yep. So the requirement is just this dollar symbol. So you can. You don't necessarily need this dollar symbol, but if you're going to do any type of expression, like say, like if you're doing a math formula in here, again, you wouldn't do this for a string, but if you wanted to do that, you needed those brackets to contain that expression. So here I'm just going to go through and let's create a player, right? So I'm going to call the constructor with the new keyword. I use one of mine. Right. So then we can change this text. Let's see. We can say like welcome. I'm actually going to go. Yeah. I want to delete this up here, but just return the username. refresh here. All right, so that's a little example there. So if we go back to that, right, player 1 is referring to this, but the reason why it's printing, you know, the username is because of this toString method here. Yep.
I have a question from the internet. If you, when you define a variable, does it have a default value or is it undefined?
It's null. Default is null. So what the question is, and now I can show an example. If I said player 2, if I just did, and I didn't assign anything to it, I'll do as a print here. And I'll show you what it does in the console. So it should just, so anytime you do print, it's going to come up in the console here, and it just prints null. So that is something to know about Dart. Everything, if it's not assigned, it's going to be null. And another thing with Dart, and this may make some sense to some of you, and some of you probably don't have enough knowledge yet to understand what other programming languages do, but everything in Dart is an object. Functions are objects, classes are objects, everything is an object. So.
I got the question.
Yep.
If it's if you give it a type instead of just using var.
It was still, so let's see if I get that, understand.
Like what if it's a string?
So even if you do string, yeah, it doesn't do default types, yeah. That's the question, I think, right there. Oops. Oops. So you could define a string there, and that still should be null there. Yeah. Some programming language, it would kind of deduce that, hey, you said this should be a string, so this should be a default of, you know, an empty string. But it's always going to be null here. So you can always be extra verbose in a lot of these stuff. And I could have said, hey, this is a player type here. But that's kind of unnecessary here because the constructor kind of implies that that's going to be a player object. But maybe I wanted to put the player object at a global scope, so it may make more sense to say player 1. And not define it, but then here in the code, I'm going to say that player 1 is new player. Okay. So Dart can actually have multiple constructors, and it has what we call name constructors. So let's see. Right, so here, if we do player dot and then any word, that's going to be a name constructor. So maybe this, I'm not going to implement anything, but so this may do, say username is equal to some random name. Right, because you imagine you have a name generator or something that would automatically generate a name for them. So then I could come down here and say, let's create player 2 equals new player dot random. Okay, so that's going to create a player object also. And then if we, you know, I can just replace that with 2, and that should see. Done. All right.
Now, if you wanted to actually choose a different random name, would you just put multiple usernames in the player.random?
Sure, you can, you know, we could do a map up here, or we can just do a list of random names. Like, so here we can maybe do string equals, or random names. I don't know, right? We can do, you know, Thor.
Don't forget Hulk.
Yeah, yeah. Put a Hulk up here.
No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. And then we can replace this. So Dart doesn't necessarily, like, arrays are the same things as list in Dart. We call them list. So a random names, we can say So again, I love static typing because here we get access to all of our methods. I almost think there's a random method, but I could be wrong. Yeah. But we could just come up here and do import math, and math has let's see here, we got 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, we can probably just we can do something. Let's see what that works. Yeah. Yep. Well, I think my random is doing from 0 to 1. I'd have to add a little bit more. But essentially, so what I'm doing, I'm accessing this this list, and I was trying to grab a random number.
I've noticed on randomization when especially if you don't have that large of a list, sometimes it'll get the same one like a few times.
Yeah, so I don't have a random seed, so that's usually you sometimes randomly create a seed every time. So yeah, random on computers isn't always actually random. So any other questions? Nope. How long are we supposed to go here? I'll just keep on going until.
Oh, I mean, as long as you want to. You're about half hour in.
Okay.
How does the package management stuff work?
So, if we're doing games, a lot of times you need, you need an extra math library. So we do a lot of vector math. So here's an example of how I would do that. To find them, right, most people go to NPM's website. So Dart has, if you go to the Dart website, there's pub, which is where they have all their packages. So if you wanted to search for...
Is pub basically kind of its version of NPM?
Yeah.
Basically.
So if I search for vector here, I want to see vector math. So it gives information about it. You can find the GitHub page, everything you kind of expect. This is just coming from the README file of the package, but it also does tell you how to install it. This is guaranteed on all these packages to give you an example of how to install it. And there's a list of versions here. So I can come here and just copy this if I wanted to. And then do and I can either call pub-get on the terminal or just do get dependencies here. And so then I have access to do packages. So everything that's contained in the core SDK will have a prefix of Dart on it, but packages will have this syntax here. You say package, and there's my vector math. Dart. Okay. So then I also can do, and this is always smart to do, is you can essentially namespace it there. I can say that's SVM. So now if I wanted to use one of those classes, I can start going vm.vector2. So that's a point, the new vector2. And again, if we look, there's actually, let's get so if you notice, these are all the constructors. That's the default one, and then there's several named one. There's one that says all, so it assigns all the values to whatever value you put. Copy it from a list, from a buffer, from random. So here I can create a random one, a 0. So there's all kinds of these named constructors that you can use. Again, this vector class has a toString method, so if we refresh, right? Yeah, looks like I have a problem. not really sure. I had this problem earlier today and it randomly went away. I think it has to do with more my file system. Something's not updating. I did it in another project and it worked just fine. I think it has to do with since I updated the packages, I needed to restart the server. I think that's what the problem with that is. So now there you go. Now I picked a different one. So and that's the variable, the vector there that I just created. Okay, let's see here. Let's see here. So we can add methods to this class. Methods defined outside of a class are just functions. So let's maybe do this is pointless, but we're going to create a function that says create player. So functions can have parameters. They can be named, default parameter, or just normal parameters, named parameters, or positional parameters. So just your normal one would be like, all right, username, return new player. Again, this is pointless here. It doesn't really make sense as a programming perspective, but just to show off. So that would create a new player, player name. So this is a name parameter. So a name parameter would look like this. Defining a name parameter would look like that, and I'll show you how to use these in a second. And then a positional, we'll do, let's say a positional one would be first name. All right, so if we wanted to use these, I can say, so the first example is just create player with, passing a name. The other one was with name parameters. So to use the name parameters, you would have to say if I do my syntax help here, you can see username, so I'm going to have to actually say this is the parameter that I'm going to define. And then the positional one, it's just like the first one, but there was an optional second one, so I can pass in, my first and last name here. But since the second one was positional, it's not necessarily required. Okay, so those two are valid. So usually, again, back to if you don't define something, what is it? Well, in this case, it's null. So usually on your positional parameters, you're always going to want to add a default value. So the positional makes sense on something that you're typically going to have a default value, but on occasion, you may not. You can also have default values on named parameters. My preference is to use named parameters as much as possible. Because especially when you're dealing with, if you're providing an API or service for other developers to use, there's less chance you're going to break their code. Like if you add, let's say, an option to a method, like maybe this method's going to do something else if you pass in a certain option, or it's a new feature, it's so much easier just to add that extra named parameter because it's not going to break their code most of the time. Because this is named, if I go in and add another requirement and say age, right? And say everyone has to be 18. that's not going to break this down here. And it adds that ability just to add new features. So you'll see that a lot in JavaScript world, where you'll see people like pass in an array or a map of key values. A lot of times you'll see that a lot in dynamic languages like PHP also, because there's no really way to define these. So a lot of people just say, well, pass me an options array, and then we'll use that options array to determine what we're going to do in this method. So these named parameters kind of play that role. All right, any other questions?
How do you use JavaScript from inside of Dart?
I wasn't going to go into that too much, but you can. Let me bring up the package here. Let's see here. So essentially here, Dart has annotations. So essentially you're just defining, you're going to say there's some external thing, so that external thing is some JavaScript library that you're loading in. And you're going to define what it does. So it's a function that returns a string and accepts some sort of object. And then you're going to do this annotation on the top. So this refers to what it would be on your web browser. So it's a JSON.stringify, so that knows how to go look for that when it compiles. So here's an example of using Google Maps. So it's defining a library, say, hey, that library is this namespace in the JavaScript world, google.maps. And so you can just go through and define them. So it's very, again, if you're in the TypeScript world, you would go through and define your interfaces. So you can interact with JavaScript if you need to, even though most of your code may be written in Dart. So.
Can you pull libraries in from NPM?
I mean, you could work it into your workflow. So the question is whether you should. So again, the Dart SDK comes with a lot of that stuff that you would be pulling in from NPM. So.
So basically already kind of packaged in with it. So
yeah, and there's the equivalents of those libraries in Dart for the most part. I mean, there's probably examples of some that aren't, but. Okay.
Does Dart have method overriding?
So for multiple methods with same signature or with different signatures, no, it does not. Unfortunately, I hope it gets it.
In version 2.
Yeah, it's one of those requirements that I'm hoping to talk to the Dart team and actually get them to, because it's important for what I'm doing. It does have what we call operator overloading, which is a very nice feature. For what I'm doing when it comes to, I really want it for the vector math. So it doesn't really help because in a vector world, you should be able to do vector 3 plus vector 3, but since you can only override one, you can't you have to choose whether you're going to do the constant or the vector, so you're a little bit limited. So it is a feature I hope it gets.
What about static variables and static methods in classes? Is that a thing in Dart?
Yes. So what he's asking there is a static or global method, so we can go and so I can turn these. I'll turn one of these into static. So we'll put that, and we'll declare it as static in front of it. So that's this method now. Again, this is the great thing about Dart is because it's going to throw you errors before you even try to go compile or go check on your web browser. So here I'm getting an error. So I need to I move that as a static method on that class. So I need to do player.create player. Okay. So I understand this. A lot of this stuff's redundant. You would never do this in real life, but so another cool thing about Dart is it has what we call getter and setter methods. So let's say maybe once the user creates I'll always, let's say every time someone creates a user, I want to put a random number on the back of their name for some reason, right? Some sort of ID. So what I'm going to do, let's see here. I'm going to make this a private class, or a variable. So this means that classes and packages outside of this package cannot access this username variable directly, okay? So now I get an error here because I changed the word, so let's just delete some of this stuff here. So before I could access that variable from, right, before I changed that, I could do that, and that would have been valid. But since I changed it, you would think you would access it by just changing the name to be the same as that, but this means it's a private variable. That means it's non-accessible outside of that class. So what we could do is to make it accessible is we can define a getter method. So we can say string get username. We're going to use this I'll do a normal method first so it looks familiar. Return username. So now since I've created this getter, it allows me to dynamically get this property. So now I could do that. And if I printed that out, it should print the username. So this is great for like maybe if you want to do computation anytime. Again, if you wanted to append like username and ID together, so this could be, instead of just returning username, I'm wanting to return, underscore 123 or whatever their username or user ID is. We also can add a setter method which again, it kind of lets us add a little bit more code ability to our getting and setting properties. So inside we need to set the private variable.
Setter, you don't want to return better.
Yep, that's what it is. Thank you. His name plus, what. So now if we go, let's say, I want to change my name, so I want to use the setter. I'll use another one. My previous one is.
I'm looking over here,
Huh?
Do you define methods as public or private?
So again, there's you can do them as private methods inside the class, and by just doing the underscore.
Oh, okay.
So if there's like, let's say, the player is killed in a first-person shooter.
Oh, so it's just the underscore that.
It is just the underscore. That's the equivalent of like some other languages you would used to see private or public keyword. So there's no. A lot of languages have like private, protected, and public.
Right.
So there's just private and public. So.
And then
Private is
all you
just-
gotta do is put that on.
And just the underscore.
That's pretty cool.
So.
Okay.
Okay. So there's a caveat to the private and public. When something's private, it's private to the entire library that you're building. It's not just to the class. So it's a little bit different than other programming
Not
languages.
protected, so you can't have like a package which is protected.
Yeah, so that's why the private is available to every other classes. It's equivalent of a protected, really.
Okay.
So
Alright.
it's kind of confusing on the wording, but
Yeah,
I would consider it more protected.
Okay. That makes more sense.
They actually they went for a simpler, concept. But if you're familiar with other languages, you get confused because you're like, all right, well, other ones do this, but so let's see what that prints. So we should expect it if we go through that. So let's walk through it. So I'm setting my name to the human machine, and then we're saying forget that, I want to change it. So I'm going to do it to give me some fries. But this is going to call the setter. So if I look up the code, so it's saying set username equals this. So that's going to come up here to the setter. So the name here is give me some fries, but it's going to append underscore player1 here to the private variable username. But then when we go to print it, it's going to call this method here, username, but it's going to append 1, 2, 3, 4. So we should see give me some fries underscore player1 underscore 1, 2, 3, 4 is what we should expect in the console. So yeah, it's kind of small there. There we go. So, I'm going to explore some things, make sure I'm not missing anything that's. So the documentation, I have to admit, I feel like the core language tour of Dart is probably one of the best documentations I've seen to introduce a language. It's really not too long. It's about maybe a 20-minute read to go through and read all of it. Talk about variables. All right, so the built-in types, we have numbers and strings and booleans and lists and maps are the main ones that you're going to get. Functions, we did optional named parameters. Right. If statements, for loops are pretty much like any other language out there, so I probably won't spend much time on that. I'll show you some in my other example I got, but
you mentioned that that functions are objects. That means you treat them like delegates.
Yeah, so you can pass them around and do whatever you want with them. So let's see if they got a good example on the. So here we're defining a function of print element, and here's a list of 1, 2, 3, and it's saying list for each. Do that method there. So it also does have this arrow syntax. This is the same thing as defining a function. It's just trying to put it all in one line. It's just kind of a streamlined syntax. I mean, there's a lot to Dart. I'm probably not going to cover everything here, but Dart does, when it comes to Dart supports what we call, is everyone familiar with futures promises in JavaScript? No, some people. Okay, so especially in the web, we're dealing with asynchronous stuff. So when you do if you do an AJAX request, you're sending off data to the server, and there's a delay from when that server responds back to you. All right, we call that asynchronous because it doesn't. When you do that, your browser doesn't lock up. In synchronous programming, you would expect your browser to lock up, and then you would be stuck there until you get that request back from the server. But in asynchronous, you send the request off. You can do whatever you want in that time frame. It's still everything keeps running, and then when you get that response back, it will trigger the promise and execute. I'll try to find a good example of that. And then, so promises are good for one-off things, right? So you send an HTTP request to the server, and you expect one response back. So it's the equivalent of a single variable. We also have list. So the asynchronous equivalent of a list is a string. So this is think about WebSockets or in a game, right? When multiplayer games continues, or chat application, that'd probably be better, right? So when you have Slack open, it's continuously waiting for the next message, the next message, the next message. So that's an example of a stream. So you can have access to the stream, and you would just listen to that stream, and every time that message would come through, you would have access to that. All right, let me try it. I'll just, instead of going through and hand coding everything, I'll go through an example I made. So I'm going to stop this server. And by game, I meant very, very, literally a simple game. Let's see, that should be loading up here. All right, so we got a play area with some enemies here, and if we press the space bar, we got some bullets going around, and eventually they should die. So, and it's shooting wherever my mouse is. Let's see if I can get that one. Yeah, there we go. All right, simple game, right? So I'll walk through the code and how I did that. So here's my main function. So here again, I'm just getting that, I'm doing a query selection for that output, so that div that's in my HTML file. Again, this is just a plain HTML file with the div with the ID of output. So I'm just doing a query selector. So notice up here, when I imported Dart HTML, I did it as HTML, so that means I need to prefix everything with HTML dot. So this is a great, because if you have multiple packages or multiple libraries that are using the same naming conventions for something, adding this prefix will help avoid collisions. Okay. So your typical things that you do on web is collecting events, so button clicks, key presses. So this is an example of using a stream. So this is kind of nice because Dart, in the JavaScript world, you would provide a function, and that function is called every time your key event happens. So here I have the HTML.window, and on key up. So if I click on here and look at this, so it describes it as a stream of keyboard events. Okay. So a stream has several different functions. Let's go to the stream documentation. So again, you're listing all these events coming through. You can call any of these methods typically return another stream, and it may have altered what the elements are, filtered some of them out. So what I did, if you look at the documentation, is I did where. So here at where, so on the event, I'm looking for which. So this is kind of weird wording, but if you're looking for a certain keystroke, so this is looking for the space bar. The space bar is labeled as number 32, key 32. So on this stream, I'm going to filter out, or I want to keep all the ones where it's the space bar, which is number 32, and then it's creating another stream, and I'm listening to that stream for all those events. And so every time a space bar is pressed, I'm going to add a new missile being shot. So, make sense? Any questions? So streams is one of those things. It's probably one of the best features out of Dart, and it does make it great for working with WebSockets and a lot of web things. There's a group of libraries called, I guess it's just called the RX libraries, and they essentially make the same library for all programming languages. And essentially it is the stream concept, or observables is what they call them. So you're listening to a stream of events. So they've written the same library pretty much for JavaScript, for Java, for C#, like any programming language you can think of. They essentially repackage the same library. It has the same fundamental concepts. But they pretty much don't even need that library for Dart, because Dart just includes pretty much all of it inside the SDK. So there I'm listening to the key up event, and also doing another event here. I'm doing the mouse move event. Okay, so every time the mouse moves, I'm going to get the position of the X and Y, and I'm going to save it to this mouse position that I have. If you go up here, I got mouse position is just a vector where I'm storing that data. So that way I always have like the last known mouse position so I can use it in my calculations. So here's another great feature of Dart is Dart has what we call cascading. I'm going to kind of type this out as we go. So here we have area. Area is representing that div. All right, so I want to apply styling to that. So most of the time people will do that in CSS, but there's no reason why you can't do that in JavaScript. So notice here I'm going to change the style properties of the style object. So I'm going to do 2 periods here. So what that means is every time I do something, I'm going to go back to that original style object. Okay, so here if I say width is 600 pixels, that needs to be a string. So again, now when I'm doing another 2 periods, this would be the equivalent of doing, here I'll write this out and I'll show you what it's equivalent of. So this would be the equivalent of me doing this dot width okay, so it would be the equivalent of these 2 lines. So notice how we have the width of this property is the width is a property of style and height is a property of style, but we just reference the style by doing these 2 periods. So we can just chain those up. So a lot of libraries you'll see, especially on server-side code with databases, you have this kind of this builder concept. Let's see if I can mock up a class. So you may have like, in a lot of frameworks you would have something like a query class. And that query class would have like things you would do in SQL, like where clauses, selection clauses, and they would typically, you would see this. Like if we had has, all right, I'll just, they would do something. Select, like there would be your, whenever you're selecting. So you see this pattern a lot. So then down in my main function, actually I'll just do it up here so it's all there. You would do like, so I'm going to do an SQL query equals new query, and then you would see them do query dot where, or I'm going to select, ID, name, whatever columns I'm selecting, and then they would chain this up. Query. Nope, we're having a conflict of types. But so essentially they would do that. And the problem with this is it takes away your ability to return something valuable, like an error message, or just some. You're using your return method to chain. Okay, with Dart that's unnecessary because we can use this cascading. So I could just return like some error message or success or whatever would make sense for this method. Right, and then you would all you have to do is just go add 2 periods to all these, and you wouldn't have to waste your return statements. It probably wouldn't make, usually, or a Boolean, whether it was successful or not is another possibility. So that's the benefit of the cascades. Does that make sense? Kind of. So. It's probably one of my favorite features. So I use it a lot in the styling here again, using the cascade. So this is the enemy, so the red squares, I'm going through and saying, hey, there's a width of 30, height 30, background color, position absolute, and the positions. So here's an example of me doing using the getter there. So I'm returning a boolean whether this enemy is dead or not, and that just depends if it's less than or equal to 0. So there it looks like just a normal property, but it's actually doing calculations. But to the developers using it, they don't need to know that there's a calculation underneath. So I have a class for the enemy and a class for the missile, showing the position and the direction that it's going. The direction is determined just by where the mouse is, so it's just doing a difference. And then there's the enemy manager, which it goes through every time we update the frame, we go through and we do a check to see if the missile hits them, and if it doesn't, we remove them from the list and they disappear from the screen. All right, any other questions?
What do you do with Dart?
What do I do with Dart? Okay, so I've been working for about a year on a project called SolariumVR. And what I'm doing is I'm building a web browser specifically for virtual reality, but instead of using JavaScript, I'm using Dart. But I'm not using the Dart to JavaScript compiler, I'm actually using the Dart virtual machine. So I integrate the background stuff in C++, and it's communicating the Dart in the front end. So if you're a developer, you're going to use all your code's going to be written in Dart. So when you go to a website, in my application, you would go, instead of going to an index.html file or something, you would actually go to an index.dart file, and it will load that script and execute that script. So some of the reasons that I chose Dart over JavaScript is, one, Dart has a virtual machine. So there's not that many languages that use a virtual machine that's usable for what I'm using. Has operator overloading, which is great for the vector and matrix math. It's faster than JavaScript, the virtual machine is. A lot of the people who worked on the V8 virtual machine for Chrome actually are on the Dart team now. And because of how the language is, it's a lot more static compared to like JavaScript. So JavaScript is so dynamic because all your variables can change types, and they can be a string, number, like all these different types. And so the JIT compiler for JavaScript on your browser has to take wild guesses. And sometimes they'll take a guess, and that guess is right, and they'll be able to do some optimizations on that in the background. This is stuff beyond my knowledge, or I just have a general idea of how it works. So they're able to do, they take guesses about those optimizations. But if you, as a programmer, this is one reason why you shouldn't be changing your types. Even though you can change your types all the time in JavaScript, you shouldn't. Because if you change your type, the virtual machine's going to go, oh, I thought I knew what this was, but now I don't. So now I have to what I thought I knew is wrong. So I need to slow down, reanalyze, make a new assumption, optimize for that assumption, and hopefully we can speed things up. So you should, and that's why using languages like TypeScript or Dart will speed up your JavaScript applications on the web, because it can make improvements like that without you even knowing about it. So
could you have used Java to build this, or?
I could have. Java has a virtual machine, right? Everyone thought, 10, 20 years ago, whatever, JVM was going to be everywhere. It's going to be over the web. There's some people try to make browsers out of the Java virtual machine. And it didn't pan out. There's a lot of legal issues, right? I mean, even though Google won the battle against Oracle, it's still debatable whether, So Google has a secret project called Fuchsia, and Fuchsia appears to be, it's open source, all the code's out there, but they haven't announced it, which is kind of odd. But it's a new operating system, and from what I can tell, they're taking everything they learned from Chrome and Chromium and the Chrome OS and Android and kind of cleaning up all their code and reapplying it to Fuchsia. But there's no Java in it. They're using Dart as kind of their main programming language. So Google itself is making an internal bet on Dart. And I'm guessing it's because they were sued by Oracle and they had to go through all that legal ballot. So it's better just to. So Dart it's open source. It's an open specification. So it's open source as open source can get. So.
So by using Dart for your stuff, you're kind of banking on the Chrome OS, like that direction of things for like Google products to like continue to be like a main thing, right?
I mean, I'm using a lot of Google open source project. Like I wouldn't be working on what I'm doing without all their open source. So I am kind of taking a bet.
I have a Chromebook now. Like I didn't really realize until recently when I got it that they were getting into like the whole operating system kind of stuff too.
Mm-hmm. So the Chrome OS, the Chromebook is pretty much just it's Linux with Chrome on top of it. Like it's literally like the same source code as Chrome. They just have conditionals in the compiling process.
With this Fuchsia stuff, how would that be different? Is it just like a
It's different on a lot of technical. It's a different type of operating system. It's actually not Linux based. So that's again beyond.
So it's not Unix based either or anything.
I guess it would. I forget it. It's a microkernel, which is a little
So
bit
they're
different.
kind of like starting from scratch.
I don't know. It could just be someone's side project for all I know, but it seems to be where they're taking a lot of their Chrome and Android code and cleaning up using modern C++ programming practices and stuff like that. So, but it is just interesting to kind of watch them do it. So.
Just to sidetrack just for a second, where you got mentioned Chrome OS, and it's actually Linux, but so is it basically using Chrome as the shell for Linux, basically?
Yeah. Any question about JavaScript? I've done plenty of JavaScript stuff too. So one question is, when would you choose Dart, right? A small marketing style website, it wouldn't make any sense. It's too much overhead. Dart has a conference coming up, or it may have been at the last conference, and all developers always like to sneak stuff into the console and the websites or in the CSS and stuff. And you open up the console and they're like, why isn't this written in Dart? Why wouldn't you use Dart? It's like, well, because it just doesn't make sense. It's just a small website. It's a one-page, simple website that doesn't make sense. Places it does is large SaaS applications. I mean, when you're talking hundreds of thousands of lines of code, you're going to get a lot of benefit as a team, especially because you have all the types. It makes refactoring easy. So if you want to change the name of a type, it's going to be so much easier to use it properly. Code analysis.
This might be kind of a dumb question, but a SaaS application that doesn't have anything to do with the SaaS.
Oh no, I just mean any type of web application that's that has a lot of features. Anything that you would probably use if you're working with Angular, I would check out Angular Dart. So yeah, I wouldn't use it for small things. If you're looking at game dev on the web, I absolutely would look at it. The operator overloading for vector math is a absolutely great feature. So it makes it feels like if you're doing anything in C# and Unity, it feels very similar to that.
There's another question from Chris on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, how is the job market in Louisville for Dart development?
Dart? No, none. So I mean, I don't know personally of any other one besides me using it. It's kind of interesting because, like I said, it was introduced kind of in 2011. I mean, it hasn't gone anywhere. It's continuously developed. It's gotten more people. It's not as hyped as Node.js was. I would argue it's a lot more stable. Some of the packages I use, you look at last commit and it's like 2 years ago. I mean, that's not a bad thing. Like, it just didn't need to be updated or changed. It doesn't have all these constantly. Like, I mean, how many versions of Node.js have we gone through in the past, 2 years or whatever? So, it's very stable. Having that core SDK come with the library, get rid of a lot of the headaches that you see with Node.js. It makes you feel like you're working with the .NET framework, or Java comes with a lot of these similar packages, so they kind of came with that mindset. So let's see here. So some of the main packages, the Dart async, that contains your futures and your streams, anything having to do with asynchronous programming. Dart collection, it has hash maps, sets, queues, lists, different types of lists, depending on what type of optimizations you need. So it has all kinds of these classes. Not only is there this core Dart collection, the Dart team also does have a lot of extra packages that are, a layer above these. But again, they're stable, they're maintained by Google and their team. So they are very stable. They just didn't necessarily feel like they needed to be in the core SDK. But they are extra features that you can have. Dart Convert deals with encoding, so JavaScript, base64, UTF-8, so if you're needing to do any encodings. Dart HTML is, like I said, it's just the equivalent of your HTML functions inside of your browser in JavaScript. IndexedDB, that's, again, browser functionality for IndexedDB, WebAudio, WebGL, and WebSQL, which is deprecated now. SVG, again, is web. Dart Mirrors is, reflection is a property or ability of a programming language to kind of look in on itself and understand what classes it has, what methods it has. So Dart reflection is very good. A lot of people use reflection on your server side to define routes. You may say you may use the annotation to say the route /user/ID represents this function. And so anytime user goes to that route on the website, it'll trigger that function. So it's used for metadata, and a lot of frameworks uses things like that. So that's a nice library that has on top of that. Dart IO is only accessible on the Dart virtual machine on command line side. So Dart IO has stuff for HTTP servers. That's the big one. So that allows you to do equivalent what Node.js does. Read and write files, create HTTP servers, WebSocket servers, UDP servers. So any type of networking stuff is all in there. But it's only available. It's not available, obviously, on the browser. So again, all these packages really help just get you going really quickly.
So other than what you're doing with Dart, is web development the only real thing you would use it for and have it compile into JavaScript, or is there
So again, there's the Flutter project for mobile. So this is kind of interesting. So the way how they've kind of gone through their development of the programming language, so it can actually compile to multiple things. So it can compile on just in time on the virtual machine. So it just interprets it there and runs it. It compiles to JavaScript. And then for mobile, they're actually compiling to ASM like machine code, and they're actually deploying it like that. So it's highly optimized. So it's almost as if you're sending like C++ code to iOS, and that was kind of a requirement because interesting, like iOS doesn't let you execute arbitrary code. So if it doesn't let you have virtual machines and stuff on iOS. You have things like React Native, which is React, but for iOS and Android. But they still use the JavaScript virtual machine that's provided by iOS. They can't ship their own. So it's a security constraint on iOS. So they had to do, on Dart, they had to compile, do everything ahead of time, turn it to ASM code. And so Flutters are very, very cool. You should check it out afterwards if you're interested in mobile development.
If you make like a project with WebGL with Dart and use Flutter, will the draw calls be like native GL stuff in the mobile app?
So you wouldn't use. I don't think Flutter yet lets you give you access to a GL OpenGL context yet. But all of Flutter is actually, so what Flutter does is it gets just a blank canvas. It does all the rendering itself. So usually when you develop an iOS or Android app, you use all these extra libraries, UI libraries that they provide to you. So that lets you have the buttons, the material design buttons, or the iOS equivalent of those designs. Where Flutter says, forget those libraries. We're just going to do a plain canvas, and we're actually going to render all those themselves. So it's really cool. You can actually be on your Android app. On their demo, they do it. You can have your Android emulator up, and they just pick a button, and it switches to looking like an iOS app because it's all just done inside of Flutter, and it's not relying on any of the OS specific libraries. So
Does it use the DOM, or does it use a like actual canvas element?
it doesn't even use DOM. It's not web at all. So
Okay.
it's actually calling. It's just a plain it's a canvas, but not an HTML
Blank
canvas.
canvas.
Just a blank.
Gotcha.
It'd be like you're using just a empty window in Windows or something. It does use. It essentially has WebKit in it. Takes some of the WebKit rendering stuff, and they stripped out a lot of stuff, and that's kind of the core rendering process.
And it's called Flutter.
Flutter, Flutter. So.
Might check that out. Might do more.
So I can keep talking, or are we good? Or
Are there any more questions?
Do you have a demo for your thing you're working on?
if you have an Oculus Rift, sure.
Oh,
Yeah, it may work. Do you have a Vive?
Do you honestly have the like the drivers and everything set up for an Oculus? Because we have a DK2.
It's not gonna run on this machine. So that's the problem. You need like a $2,000 laptop to.
Yeah.
So, and I don't like dragging around my big desktop at home. So.
Thanks.
I don't know. We may see if we can maybe get it on work on his Vive, maybe if
Yeah,
he's interested.
He's got work to do.
Yeah.
So
So.
you're mainly developing with the Oculus Rift?
So I have to do everything. So when you make a game on like Unity that does all that like cross compatibility stuff for you for the most part. But since I'm doing everything myself, like it just takes time. So,
You have to kind of yourself make it work.
yeah.
Well,
So it's more of just time. Haven't allocated time to do that yet. But there's no reason why I shouldn't. So. Cool.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks everyone.